Hello, and welcome to Book 3, Chapter 4 of You Should Be Reading. Today, this week, I would like to talk about The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. Now, I have read one of his books before, The Chrysalids, way back many years ago in high school, and I hadn't known that he'd written this, because I remember seeing the movie The Day of the Triffids, which was put out long before I was born. I believe it was back in the 60s. It may have been still a black and white movie. I'm not 100% sure on that. But the movie itself was just kind of weird and strange. The book, however, the book is so much better than the movie. Um, so far, there's only a very few books that have been made into movies that far back that are any good. And this book is one you just go with the book, ignore the movie. What's it about? Well, it's kind of like a post-apocalyptic zombie story, in a way. The only difference is it's not zombies. It's large, mobile, carnivorous plants called Triffids that just all of a sudden show up one day in the world and start growing and basically entrenching themselves because they grow, they pollinate like plants do, and then more of them pop up and more of them pop up. And they were considered a bit of a danger, especially if you weren't careful around them. But they became quite ever so useful because of the oils that they could get out of them. So they began cultivating them. They had big triffid farms where they grew and ended up extracting the oils from them as need be, just like any plant, like any agricultural thing. And there's suspicion that it was a modified plant that was going to be like a biological weapon, possibly by the Russians, maybe not. Keep in mind, this particular book was made in 1951, is when it was published. Pretty much at the beginning of the Cold War-ish type era. So there was a lot of things like that. And Mr. Wyndham had just come out of the Second World War and wasn't very, what's the word I'm looking for? He wasn't very full of optimism for his own government, for humanity at large. And the book kind of shows that. Anyways, years later, after they've cultivated all these triffids, and they're everywhere, um, one thing of interesting note is that the triffids have this long stinger that pops out of their petals, which can attack. They usually go for the face, go for the eyes, and try to blind the person. The venom tends to knock people out as well. And the Triffids then can just wait for them to die and decompose and then just peel flesh off them and eat it. It's rather nasty and grotesque. Um, but the interesting thing is, uh, despite all this danger and despite what the Triffids were all very alien, they were kept around. And then when this book begins, there was a meteor shower. This, the sky was full of strange green shooting stars, and practically everybody in the world went and saw this meteor shower. And then the next day, or possibly a couple days later, everybody suddenly woke up blind. Everyone that had seen this meteor shower. There were some that hadn't. One being our main character, Mr. Bill Mason. He did not watch this because he'd been blinded by a Triffid. Um, he'd been attacked many times over the years and has had a bit of a resistance built up. He was temporarily blinded by a Triffid, so his eyes were covered. He couldn't see anything. And it ended up being he was in the hospital. He wakes up, nobody's around, everything's super quiet, nobody's come to wake him up, and he's a little pissed off. Ends up wandering out and finding everybody's blind. But not everybody, almost everybody. He stumbles across a woman named Josella, and there's a bit of a romantic interest that builds up there. Um, she's a well-off to do young lady who ended up publishing a book about, I can't remember the exact name of it, but the word sex was in the title, and this was back in the time, like the 1950s, when this was put out. So just imagine what that would be like in the 50s. A woman publishing a book like that. She was rather looked down upon for it. Uh, and it goes from there in the aftermath of this great thing when suddenly everybody's blind. And Mr. Mason, he's one of the first to realize that trying to help all of these people that have been blinded is just going to be trouble because food's going to run out eventually. You're going to have to grow your own. He realizes this pretty much right off the bat, and he knows. He knows that trying to help these people is just, unless they can learn to help themselves, it will be fruitless, a completely fruitless gesture. And so it follows his travels along this wonderful along the English countryside where he's trying to find Josella after he gets separated from her. Uh, Ends up getting misdirected, does eventually find her, and it kind of slowly comes to an end, uh, but not really an end. There's a page at the end saying, this is where my story ends. The rest of what happened can be found detailed in the history of the settlement or the colony, I think they call it, which somebody else was doing, and that's the end of the book. It kind of ends on that almost hopeful note, uh, but it is a very interesting one, and in a world where there is so many zombie movies out there, so many zombie books out there. This was a bit of a breath of fresh air to see a post-apocalyptic world where plants were the problem, and they were a problem. Make no mistake, they were a problem. They were nasty, nasty things, um, even though they didn't seem it at first, which is very interesting. I like that slow build to it. So definitely check it out. And this week, you should be reading The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. It is worth your time. Another piece of classic literature. And next time, until next week, I'll see you then.